All right, good morning, class. This is Mr. Harris, and this is this week's presentation for you guys for World Studies. This is about China in modern times. Unfortunately, because how the year's worked out, we haven't had as much time to talk about China as I would like, and we kind of missed out on a lot of history of China. But I'm going to try to make you guys understand as much as possible kind of what's going on today of China and how does this relate to us. So, the fall of the Manchu dynasty is the first thing we'll start with. China had a series of dynasties throughout its history where one leader would go to the next in a family. The last one was ruled by the people called the Qing from Manchuria, which is northeastern China. And the last person in charge was the Dowager Cixi, so she was the mother of the emperor, and she had ruled China for quite a bit long a time. She was very conservative and against foreigners, which we'll see why in a second. But many people blamed her for the power the foreign imperialists had in China at the time. So they rebelled against her. And the leader of the First Republican Revolution was a guy named Sun Yat-sen. And he founded the Kuomintang Party, the Nationalist Party of China. Now, I know these words may be new to you guys, but it's very important we start recognizing these terms because it's going to play out in Chinese history going forward. So they had a system with emperors and empresses ruling over the country. The people thought that system was very corrupt, so there was a revolution to have a more of a representative system put in place, led by this guy, Sun Yat-sen. So he got rid of that old dynasty and established a republic. Unfortunately, at the time they established this republic, it wasn't a very strong country. There was a lot of disunity throughout China, with local warlords would fight each other for control, as well as the Kuomintang, who was trying to set up the central government. And for about 16 years, there'd be a series, of little wars between the Kuomintang and the different warlords of China. At the same time, you did have the presence of foreign imperialists in China. There was a great deal of American influence in the East, as well as European influence, and the Japanese influence would only grow during this time period. China itself was not as industrialized as the rest of the world. In 1914, it had only 6,000 miles of railroad track, while the United States had 225,000 miles. It also didn't have a lot of decent roads, so it wasn't a very interconnected country in this time period. So during this period, the foreign countries wanted more control in China for trading to make themselves rich, and China, of course, wanted them out of China. But they weren't really strong enough at this time to kick the Europeans out. And Chinese today talk about a century of humiliation in which foreign powers kind of dictated what was happening inside of their country, going back to the Opium War all the way through World War II. China did not sign the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, and Japan actually gained some of the Germany's possessions, including some areas in the cities of eastern China today. Now, Sun Yat-sen, who was leader of the Kuomintang Party, was a quote-unquote Republican. However, at the same time, he needed help from outside sources. And one of the people he asked for help from was from the Russians, who at the time had just become the Soviet Union. And they supported a political philosophy called communism. And communism is the idea that all property is shared between people and everything is kind of owned and controlled by the state, okay, by the federal government. They own and control everything. So China got loans, advisors, weapons, propaganda from the Soviet Union. And at the same time, the Russia was like, listen, be our friends, and we'll get rid of our presence in your country. We'll help you out. So the Kuomintang, which was supposed to be a new government for China, becomes split in this time period. And just like kind of we have in the US, we've got factions of people. On the right wing, we're the business people, the people that only cared about making money, and then a bunch of politicians who wanted to see themselves in charge. The left wing was more of these communists. People thought that all property should be shared. Intellectuals, university students, radicals, okay? And there was this succession movement where Sun Yat-sen died, and he was replaced by a guy named Chiang Kai-shek. Okay, and Chiang Kai-shek really did not like the Communist Party, so he kicked the communists out of his group, the Kuomintang, and this started a civil war. Okay, so at this point in time, the capital of China is in today's was moved to Nanjing, which we'll see is a mistake. Today, the capital of China is in Beijing. Okay. So there's a long civil war in China, and there's kind of a couple different time periods where it rises up. Initially between 1927 and 32, small moment of peace, and then it continues on to 33 to 37. And this is a war between the communists and the nationalists. The communists are led by a guy named Mao Zedong, and the nationalists are led by this guy named King Chiang Kai-shek. Now, the war was halted occasionally to fight the invasion of Japan. The second period here is during World War II, and the Japanese attempted to conquer China in this period. So these groups, even though they want to fight each other for control of their country, occasionally had to stop to fight off Japan. And after World War II, the communists start to dominate. Okay, so this area in red is the area that's led by the communists. The area in white is the area that is led by the nationalists. And then Tibet at this point in time is pretty much an independent country. The communists found a lot of support in the north and then began moving south, slowly over time, taking up more and more of the territory. They also took over what is Tibet today. And then, if you see by 1950, there's just this little island left over that is not ruled by the communists. That island today is called Taiwan. Okay, so after World War II, the communists and nationals resumed their civil war. The communists were better organized, more willing to sacrifice in some ways, and they were supported by the Soviet Union. Many Kuomintang actually switched alliances to the communists, especially as they started to win. And by December 1949, the communists were in complete control, and they considered this kind of the birth of modern China. And Chiang Kai shek and the nationalists ran away to the island of Formosa, and that today we call that island Taiwan. So they have different governments today in Taiwan and in mainland China. Okay. So the People's Republic of China, which is the Communist Party, they rule over all this land in purple. They also claim all this land down here in the South China Sea. And then the Republic of China is today the rulers of Taiwan. Okay. Now, technically, the Republic of China claims they rule all of China, and the People's Republic of China says they rule all of this land as well. So there has never been a peace treaty between these two groups. China considers Taiwan like a rebel province that it will someday take back. And a big fear that we have in the West is what will happen if there's ever a war between these two countries. Will the US or Europe step in to protect Taiwan? Is it worth it to us? Especially because the People's Republic of China could probably very easily overrun the island. Now, that will result in a massive amount of loss of life and things like that, but should the United States protect Taiwan? Now, let's talk about this guy named Mao for a minute, okay? Mao is one of the most important figures in world history. He was born in 1896 as the son of an affluent peasant in Hunan province. So he wasn't born a poor child, and became pretty well educated. He was in the local army, and then eventually he attended a teacher's college. Always be careful of teachers. He then went to university and worked in a library there. Okay. So Mao became the leader of the Communist Party. Now, Taiwan was treated as the official government of China until 1971 by the United States, which is kind of silly, until they decided, no, let's switch our recognition to the People's Republic of China and say, you guys are the real government. Okay. So they wanted to make all property collectivized. That means that all land is owned by the government. Let's say I have 2 acres, you have 2 acres, our neighbors have a couple acres. Now the government owns all of that property, and we work on that property. They also want to encourage a great deal more industry and manufacturing, so making physical products to sell to other countries. In this time period, the communists also put on trial all the rich people from before. Okay. If you were profiting before, were you doing that on the backs of other people? So we have in this time period what we call the trial of the landlords. So in China, a lot of the agricultural land was owned by very rich individuals who would rent it out to others and then keep most of the wealth for themselves. Well, the communists didn't like this, so they arrested a lot of those people and they accused them of different crimes. The peasants, the poor farmers, were urged to denounce crimes committed by their former rulers. And this also made the peasants more connected to from the regime because they helped get rid of some of the old people in China, some of those fully elite people. And we see lots of pictures of this, of people being accused, and sometimes they would be beaten or executed for what you had done. They also focused on becoming an industrial power. So between 1949 and 1960, China followed what the Soviet Union, Russia, was doing at the time. They built large factories and they brought in Russian engineers to help them build these factories. And a lot of the factories still exist today. There's actually some propaganda from the time, and we see actually a Russian engineer helping a Chinese engineer as they construct these mega factories. And we see this more glorious propaganda of the Chinese people working in these factories, creating new stuff for their country. Now, during this time, Mao had this idea for the Great Leap Forward. China was very poor. How to make China into a richer country? Okay. And one thing he asked people to do, even if you can't work in a factory, make your own steel. We need more steel. So he encouraged a lot of people to build backwards steel, excuse me, to build backyard steel furnaces. And he thought that if each person was out there doing the work, it would lead to this tremendous growth for their country. In reality, however, this did not work. Most of the steel produced in backyards was of poor quality and had to be pretty much thrown away. And where were they getting the ore from? A lot of them were using their own farming tools to make this new steel, so no success at all. Here's some example of some of these local steel furnaces. Another tragic policy that Mao put into place was he called for the elimination of the four pests. And we see on the side here the four pests: mosquitoes, flies, mice, and oh, it's a birdie. Are birds pests? Well, he considered sparrows in particular to be pests. And then we see on the right-hand side the people killing the last of the sparrows. Well, what happens if you kill all the sparrows? Well, sparrows, it turns out, also eat lots of insects that eat people's grain. So killing the sparrows had a really negative effect. And unfortunately, as part of this great leap forward, we get this incredible famine that occurs partially to do with this. So lots of peasants, farmers, were pulled away from their agricultural tasks in order to engage in industrialization or water conservancy projects. This lack of attention to the crops added the problem of a serious drought, and up to 30 million people in China died in this time period. Some people have those numbers even higher. It's hard to tell because it's not an open society where all records and access are shared with everybody. Okay. And we can see, though, that we look at the birth rate and the death rate. The death rate jumps up real high and the birth rate jumps down real low in this time period. And again, this was kind of a man-made famine that occurred to the policies put in place by Mao and the communists. Now, things got a little bit better, okay? Between 1961 and 1963, things were relatively quiet. But in 64, Mao actually began worrying that he was losing control of power. So he wanted to make the country even more communist, okay? And he said, we have to get rid of old ideas, old thoughts. So they attacked a lot of traditional Chinese things like Confucianism and Buddhism. And they actually took a lot of old statues and temples and burned them down. And also, they went after teachers. Mao encouraged students, especially at university, but even at high school level, to accuse their teachers of not being communist enough and to attack them. Many were beaten, some were killed, but it was more about the psychological terror that went on here. A lot of the children of communist officials were actually taken away and sent to the countryside to become even more hardcore communists. This is actually what happened to Xi Jinping. Okay. Now, the effects of Mao, somewhere between 40 and 60 million people, 60 million Chinese people died under the leadership of Mao. While he did order the killing of many people, most of those numbers died because of famines caused by his decision. And this brings up a difficult topic. Mao is kind of like the modern day George Washington of China. How should he be remembered? Officially today, the Communist Party says that a third of his ideas were wrong, but you still see his face everywhere in China, including all over the money. Now, after Mao died away, China was led next by this guy named Deng Xiaoping, who welcomed economic reforms in the direction of capitalism. Deng has this great quote where he says, I don't care if a cat is white or a cat is black as long as it catches mice. He didn't care if it was communism or capitalism as long as his country could get richer. Okay? Peasants were allowed to farm on their own and leave the collective farms. Local governments permitted to establish industrial companies that function like capitalist firms. So you see China turning more towards the rest of the world and free market capitalism, although with very particular Chinese characteristics. Instead of a group of investors owning a company, it'd usually be owned by a local state government. And there is Deng. A lot of people in China today really respect what he did as he brought Chinese people out of poverty. Okay. Now, if you go to China today, there is a lot of economic freedom in China for the average person. Okay. If you're smart enough and you do well in school, you can go to a great university and you can pretty much do most jobs you would like to do. However, the big companies are state owned. Okay. Even if you are an investor and you start your own company, you're going to have to give a lot of that company to the Communist Party and to the government of China. There is, though, very little political freedom. Okay. Now, it's not like you can't express your mind about things to your friends or anything like that. However, the average person is going to want to stay away from what we call, politics. They don't want to criticize their leader or anything like that because they'll let you get rich, but they don't necessarily want the average person to a lot of influence in how the government is run. China does have quite a few issues, and I would say its biggest one is it has enormous environmental challenges. China has become the factory of the world, and in doing so, it has destroyed its environment. China also doesn't have much arable land as we do in the United States, and it's very much polluted a lot of its water. Okay. However, what has happened in the last 30 years or so is that China has started to get rich. So, America, the United States, has been the richest country in the world since like the 1920s or something like that. And we're number one. Right now, though, China is number two. And we see there's a huge gap between the United States and China, even going into the 2000s, and that gap has just narrowed over time. Nowadays, we're only about 25% ahead of China as far as total money we're producing every year. So if we see in 2020, America made up it will is expected to make, this is pre-corona, about $22 trillion, while China is expected to make about $15 trillion. But we see those numbers going up as the US numbers don't move up as much. We see the rest of the world is far, far behind the United States and China. The current leader of China is President Xi Jinping, and he has been the leader since 2012. Now, China doesn't have open elections like we do inside the United States, so their politicians are a little bit more mysterious. Most of the decisions are made behind closed doors with meetings of the members of the Communist Party. Now, President Xi has become more conservative and authoritarian. There's been a bigger crackdown on freedom of expression and also about foreign materials coming in, books, movies, things like that. They've actually banned the teaching of like AP US history in Chinese schools. So they're getting a little more conservative. If you guys aren't aware as well, there is no Facebook in China, there is no YouTube, there is no Google. And part of that's because they want to control access to information, but also because they want Chinese people to use Chinese products. Now, President Xi has put forward the idea of the Chinese dream, which is China as a prosperous state and its people as rich individuals, sound kind of familiar to the American dream. Now, there's been a lot of controversy about President Xi. Normally, since Mao left, the presidents, and I use that term loosely because he's not really elected, rule China for 10-year periods. However, Xi has been rearranging the pieces and he changed the constitution to let himself say president forever. He's actually centralized a lot of authority underneath himself. He's also the leader of the military. So he might be the leader for life. And then something that's been getting a lot of attention recently in the news is the use of a social credit score. Now, this has not been universally put out in all of China, but there are a couple of states where they're experimenting with this. And the idea of the social credit score is the state will rate you how good of a person are you. So, how they do this? They use enormous amounts of computing technology and they use all the data they have about you to figure out are you a good person or not. So, they look at who are your circle of friends? Do you pay things on time? What kind of comments you make on social media? All their consumer behavior. What's your job, your name, your age, your sex, your family, tax information, all those things, insurance data, driving habits, workplace behavior, as well as did you break any laws? Are you following the state rules? Okay. And then they put all this information here, including little things like how charged you keep your phone. And they give you a score based on your trustworthiness and how much of a good person they think you are for them. Now, if you have a high score, you're awarded with promotions, easier to get sales on things. If you have a low score, you could actually be banned from traveling outside of the country or on certain kinds of trains and things like that. Less likely to get jobs and other things. There's an MMA fighter named Zhu Zhang who has been going around trying to prove that the old martial arts are not as effective as MMA. This hasn't made the communists very happy, so they've been taking um, points off his social credit score, and now he has to travel pretty much by car and can't use a train or an airplane. So, some examples: if you run a red light, demonstrations, all those things will make you lose money. And in China, if you criticize the government online, you can be arrested for those things. Okay, so these are all part of things that can lower your score. Oh, be part of an illegal religious event. Religion is very heavily controlled in China. They're not a big fan of it. So if you are a Christian, you have to go to a communist authorized Christian church. Okay. Now, the future, China versus the USA, I could spend a whole semester talking about this. But one of the fields that China and the USA are competing in is, of course, in technology. In this case, in the field of artificial intelligence. The field of AI is expanding rapidly and is set to dominate the next couple of decades or centuries of our life. Who will get true smart AI first, the United States or China? So PBS made this excellent documentary about it. It is kind of long, but I think you guys will find it fascinating. I added a couple of questions that go with this documentary. So if you could watch that this week and then answer those questions. And then either Thursday or Friday, I'll be giving you guys your final project for the semester. I hope you guys enjoy this lesson and you have a wonderful day.